So in this week's conversation, Anne Marie Cloister and I are going to be wrestling with, actually it's going to take 2 weeks, I think. How do Christians do history? Now,
I'll be wearing the same clothes, but don't let that fool you.
Just it might be two separate filming things. We just might be on a rotation where we wear the same clothes. I might take this off just to in Tracy McKenzie's book, he suggests that the task of a class like this is to help students at a college like Bethel, or in his case, Wheaton, think historically about the past, but also think Christianly about the past. Now, for the most part, we have not necessarily brought faith explicitly into the class at this point, and here we're going to do this. But let me start with this. To what extent is thinking historically about the past and thinking Christianly about the past exactly the same thing?
Well, I think it's very similar in that if you are a good historian, you will engage in the same kinds of practices that a historian engages in. So if I'm doing a good history of prostitution, it's probably going to look very similar in terms of the evidence I use, the secondary sources I use in order to create my piece. So it will look very similar.
I mean, I'll come back to this in our second segment for this week, but a book that I think has really been helpful to me is George Marsden. Marsden's a Reformed historian, taught at Calvin, taught at Notre Dame for a long time, trained a lot of great American religious historians, and he suggested, mostly for a secular audience, you really don't have anything to worry about. We actually play by the rules of the game. And so he talks about the fact that we abide by rules of evidence, and we are seeking to be objective. And a way I sometimes have students think about this, and so I'll frame it as a question to you. If someone were to read an article you've written or a book you're writing about the history of prostitution in California, like 1888, would they know that you were a Christian?
Well, funny you should ask, because I had students in history of sexuality read an article that I'd written, and I asked, can you tell that I'm a Christian by reading this article? And a lot of them said, if I didn't know you, I wouldn't necessarily be able to tell, except that a couple of very perceptive students, I thought, noted that I don't necessarily have the sort of celebratory tone that some of the historians who look at this have. Instead of saying, let's just look for agency on the part of these women who are, fighting the system by using the system's parameters against the system, I'm more willing to say, this was not a great system for women, and sort of acknowledge that they weren't just agents.
Okay, and now actually I want to come back to that maybe in the second half of this, because I think it is one place where Marsden, for example, does say there might be some assumptions you want to push back against on the basis of your faith.
Right, and most students did not notice a very discernible
It's very
Christian.
subtle.
Yes, it's very subtle,
Yeah.
and I do that deliberately, actually.
It could vary by field, too.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, the nature of the history I've done recently, as opposed to my graduate training of diplomatic history. If you had read articles I did in grad school or my first couple years, you would, I don't know if you'd ever think.
No.
When I've done book reviews, the one place that might slip in is like I've reviewed books about the Cold War, and I suggest maybe you're not being attentive enough to religion.
Right.
And maybe you don't know what to do with those categories. But I mean, it might be a little different if you're doing the history of Christianity. And that's really tricky, and I'm not trained as this, but talking to some evangelical historians who do evangelicalism, on the one hand, they want to be detached. They want to do the best quality work they can. They want to be respected within their guild. I think they also have at least some sense they're doing it for the church. It's at least a helpful criticism for fellow evangelicals. So when I do like history of Bethel and history of pietism, I sometimes feel like I'm getting into that area, which can be tricky.
Right, but it's also interesting to know, and I think George Marsden has acknowledged this, I'm not sure in this piece, but in another one, that one of the best historians of Puritan New England is actually a non-Christian. So
Harry Stout.
No, it's Percy.
Okay.
So anyway,
so an atheist could write the history of Puritanism
and do it very well, even if he's maybe not as attuned to certain sort of facets of the Puritan culture. So you're not necessarily a Christian because you're doing Christian history.
Exactly. No, I actually just read a piece by the president of Wesleyan University in Connecticut, who's an intellectual historian. He describes himself as a atheist secular Jew. He has a kind of cultural components. But he wrote this piece for the Wall Street Journal last week talking about bringing religious questions into his intellectual history classroom and asking people, don't just tell me what original sin means in Christian theology, but how would it feel to be a Protestant in the 16th century? And he says that he thinks it's a really important question to ask, not to convert
Right.
these students, but to develop empathy and
Right.
to help them take these people on their own terms. But his students are really uncomfortable with it,
Right.
including those who are Christian,
Right.
because it's a very hard thing to talk about in the kind of secular marketplace of ideas sometimes.
Well, and what's also sometimes challenging for Christian students who are learning about history is to sort of expose them to this idea that the Christians they read about from, say, 17th century American history are very different in their articulation of the faith. You know, they read Mary Rowlandson, for example, and she's writing about Native Americans, and they're like, whoa, this, God the Father business, this, retribution business, this wrath, that's very weird, for them to read that is in fact a fellow traveler.
So, Emery, let me go back to George Marsden. I've alluded to this book called The Outrageous Idea of Christian Scholarship. So let me read you a little bit here. And I think
Great.
this will pick up what we talked about the first segment, but then push it forward to ask what difference faith would make. So he says, in the corridors of the Pragmatic Academy, Christians and non-Christians can readily share basic standards of evidence and argument. I mean, as
Right.
you said, in many respects, we play by the same rules. He says, the fact is, explicitly Christian convictions do not very often have substantial impact on the techniques used in academic detective work, which make up the bulk of the technical scientific side of academic inquiry. Christians, just as other scholars, must employ the requisite degree of detachment in order to weigh evidence judiciously,
Right.
et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
It might be objected, however, that if Christian scholarship involves anything that makes it distinctive beyond such technical knowledge, it will violate rules essential to the mainstream academy in just those respects. So I just want to kind of leave off there because that's something we'll come back to next week. There are ways you could do distinctively Christian history that would really make those rules difficult, and so we'll talk about providential history
Okay.
next week. Can you use, for example, special revelation as a source if you're a Christian historian? So I'll just plant that and we'll come back to it. Are there ways, though, that Christian faith or practice or religious imagination or participation in church can shape the way we do history that don't necessarily violate the rules of the secular academy? What difference could it make that maybe our non-Christian colleagues would not notice or maybe appreciate, actually, or to enrich our practice of the discipline?
I think one of the things that I was very much immersed in during my education as even a high school student and then again as a college student is this idea that everybody has a worldview. Some people have a Christian worldview. Theoretically, Christians have a Christian worldview. But, even if you're not a Christian, you have a certain way that you see the world, and that's going to impact how you interpret this evidence and these secondary sources that you use. So I think there's a way that as Christians, our worldview impacts how we see that evidence and how we put it together, so that even if it is still playing by the rules and is still really good, legitimate history, it's okay to acknowledge that you, in fact, do see the world in a certain way, and that's impacted how you put that stuff together. So, I think I do not study prostitution and go, yes, women are experiencing the sexual revolution and making the most of it, and golly gee, that's fantastic. I really see this as, wow, this is a pretty cruddy situation, and a lot of people are implicated in what is happening, and I will be faithful to the women and say, here they are exerting agency, but the larger picture is one that I wish didn't exist.
I think, so to start with your first point is really important, which is it's not like Christians are the only ones who wrestle with this. I guess I would hope that secularist historians and Jewish historians, I mean, all are wrestling with the fact that there's no view from nowhere. I mean, I think here's where, I don't know, students, if you've encountered postmodernism yet, but the sense that all knowledge is embedded in something, that actually does matter.
And atheism is in itself a kind of religious viewpoint, even if it happens to contrast with a different Christian.
So, I mean, one thing Marsden is arguing for is the reason we play by the rules of the game, because to an extent that is sacrificing a way of doing history, is that it gains us admission to, he called it the pragmatic or the plural academy. He has this image from, I think, William James of it. It's like a hotel corridor. We all have our special rooms where maybe we talk differently, but in the corridor, it's got to be a shared space. So, but in those rooms, we are reflecting on how our beliefs do shape us. And so in your case, history of prostitution does maybe lend you a different vantage point.
Right, and I don't want to cede the corridor or the rooms to just non-Christian historians who are comfortable, writing about the sort of darker side of sexuality. I want to be part of that conversation, and I don't want to just say, all right, this is somehow more polluted than something else, and therefore we can't touch it, and I'm just going to, do something else. I want to be part of that conversation as another way to maybe bring about a transformative
Sure.
influence.
Yeah, in the chapter students are reading from John Fia, he
Yeah.
suggests that one way this might work out is that even within these rules, we keep
Yeah.
talking about Christians proceed from certain theological assumptions,
Yep.
or Marsden, borrowing from Nick Wolterstorff, calls them control beliefs.
Mhm.
And so one that I think you're kind of getting is the reality of sin,
Yes.
for example. Sophia writes about that. Another is the notion of the Imago Dei
Yeah.
from Genesis
Right.
1:26-20. All humans are created in the image
Yeah.
of God. Sophia has something to say about that. I know that's something you think about,
Yeah.
and incarnation probably goes with that. What does that mean for you as a historian of sexuality, prostitution, the
Yeah.
United States, or just broadly as a historian?
Well, I'd say, just to use the prostitution example again, I think sometimes, there's a tendency to sort of see prostitutes as so taboo and so off the radar that they don't actually fit into the Imago Dei. And I think it's really important to sort of say, yes, they are made in the image of God, and therefore they do need to have their respect. We need to respect these people. And I think a way to respect them is to understand what is going on and what makes them act the way they do, and understand that they are part of a connected human society.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even to tell their story. I mean,
Yeah.
it's something we talked about maybe when we were doing primary sources.
Mhm.
It's just the value of this is what people have left behind,
Right.
and to do it in a truthful, honest way, that actually is a way
Yeah.
of recognizing maybe even that kind of deep sense of dignity and worth that comes
Yeah.
from being created in the image of God.
Right.
So. Well, students, welcome back to part 2 of a conversation that started last week between Anne-Marie Koistra and myself about how Christians engage in the practice of history. So to review from last week, was to a significant, I was going to say certain, but a significant extent, thinking historically and thinking Christianly about the past probably overlap a lot.
Yeah.
That, Christians are seeking truth, and I think using the rules of evidence that other historians use help us to get that truth. We started, though, to think about what difference faith would make, and talked about the way that the reality of sin or a belief in the Imago Dei would shape us. One way it could make it different that our friend George Marsden suggested to dismiss is it could lead us to say, well, we view certain texts, for example, as having special authority. Christians believe in a set of holy scriptures as special revelation.
Yeah.
And you could, for example, write an article or a book in which you quote regularly from Scripture to support
could.
arguments you're making. You could. I mean, I've heard Mormon historians talk about the fact that that tradition has a deep sense of God revealing himself, especially through continuing prophecy, Joseph Smith, all the way up through the church hierarchy of today. You could appeal to that. So
could.
Mormon historians wrestle with that. Why should we not do that? I mean, if you do regard, let's assume we regard Scripture as authoritative and inspired and having, I mean, it's important to us, right?
It's very important.
So why would we set that off to the side when we're doing this other really important thing to us of studying the past?
Well, I think on the first gut reaction I have is that part of what motivates me to do the kind of work I do is so that I can be part of the larger discussion.
Mhm.
And in my particular field, I don't see it overrun with Christians. So as soon as I'm starting to use biblical texts, I am going to be out of that discussion and completely discounted, and that is not something I want to do. So that's a very pragmatic
Right.
rationale.
Can we talk about that, this access to the academy?
But the second thing too, it feels odd to use the Bible in writing a history, because the people I think of immediately are people like William Bradford, who coming to the shores of North America and seeing that in fact the Native American villages were decimated by disease, but they had left behind their corn and shelters.
Mm-hmm.
He saw this as an act of God.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly God's hand was at work, sweeping away the multitudes that he might make room for us. And I think I don't want to be in the position where 50 years from now, my grandchildren are looking back and going, wow, Grandma was really off in sort of suggesting that God's hand was evident in this or that fashion when, in fact, the facts do not seem to support that.
So this leads us really seamlessly into what Fia is mostly writing about this week, which is you could engage in a Christian practice of history, and frankly, a lot of Christian historians did this into the early 20th century, called providential history, where you are trying to read the hand of God at work, and you've got to balance a couple of things. So John suggests Christians have some sense, at least, of providence, that God is not this deistic watchmaker up, but he is actively engaged. The Holy Spirit is at work. The church is doing the work.
Absolutely.
And yet, he says that in almost all settings, it would be inappropriate for a Christian historian to come to the interpretation you just described.
Well, and I think, too, it's also a matter of realizing that Christians are fallen, the church is fallen, and God doesn't just work in obvious ways. Sometimes God works, I believe, through tragedy. And, to be able to say with complete clarity that, this is evidence that God is working versus this, I think God is working through everything. So to say this has some sort of special evidence versus that seems to discount then the other part of the history.
It often seems like the judgment of God in those interpretations aligns really closely with personal sense. I mean, your own worldview.
Right.
I mean, I think if we haven't talked about the virtue of humility yet in history, this maybe is a good point to start.
Right.
And this is, I think, one of John's responses. It's a profoundly unhumble way of approaching the past.
And I think it takes a lot of chutzpah on the part of a historian to be able to say, I have probed the mystery of an omniscient and omnipotent God, and I can clearly tell you what is happening here. I think you're displacing God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit there, and I think that's not a position I certainly want to be in.
Okay, let me give you a third distinctively Christian way. This might be a little trickier, but we've talked about a conviction about the reality of sin might be a kind of control belief that would shape how we do history. Won't that then lead us occasionally to want to engage in moral judgment? If history is this act of interpretation, it's not just facts, we're actually making meaning of them. Aren't there moments where, for example, as a 20th century U.S. historian, you approach the treatment of Asian Americans in California, the treatment of African Americans in the Jim Crow system? Is it wrong for you to make a moral judgment at some point rather than just describing or analyzing?
It's not wrong to make a moral judgment because, again, I think historians are just doing that. Again, it's part of the interpretation. And I think there are times when, again, though, it's important to be aware of your present bias and why you're seeing that as a moral judgment. And knowing, and to go back to the humility thing, knowing that very possibly you will be judged in 30 years as being, whoa, you were able to see that Jim Crow was a bad thing and that maybe the 1950s civil rights movement moved along too slowly. But you also have to be aware that, you've got those logs in your own eye. And I think even as you're making the moral judgments, it's really important to do that with a sense of humility that you're not understanding the complete situation at the time. I mean, one of the things with regard to civil rights, you've got some really great people out there pushing for more immediate end to various terrible practices. But it's really important to tell students, the reason that the older generation is cautious is because they're afraid their kid's going to get killed. And so, don't judge the more gradualist folks too harshly without understanding, too, that it's important to get into their shoes and see things from their perspective as well.
Right. So not just humility, but desire for empathy might drive us towards
Indeed, it's very important.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Emery, let me pick up from the theme of moral judgment and give you something I've at least heard Tracy McKenzie say, and I can't remember if he talks about in First Thanksgiving. He suggests moral judgment in the sense of you've got some kind of authority as a historian then to issue a ruling on something be in or out of moral bounds. That maybe is something to be cautious about, but one thing we shouldn't be too hesitant to engage in is what he calls moral reflection. That rather than using the vantage point of the historian to issue a judgment on a group of people for their moral blind spots, maybe it causes you to use history as a mirror and to think about where your own shortcomings. Is that something you're maybe a little bit more comfortable with? Do you see
I'm
problems
probably
with
more
that
comfortable.
as well?
I think that's probably all right. And I think especially, again, as I think about, we still deal with problems of prostitution and vice and how to regulate crime or how to, deal with criminals. And I think understanding the conditions that made prostitution prevalent in the late 19th century and then looking at what has changed, what's the same, to what degree are we not just dealing with this group of people, but to what degree am I implicated in these things? I think that is a good thing to think about. Same with civil rights, same with any of these things.
Yeah, and I think it maybe then leads us to our final topic, which is the purpose of us engaging in history, especially at a place like this, is not simply to produce books and articles, but it's a teaching calling, and it's a learning calling for students, and we'll say more about calling at the end of this webisode series. And it gets us to one of John Fia's arguments, is that the purpose of history is, in part, personal, right? It actually produces some effect. Like studying the past within this discipline actually shapes you and informs you. It makes you more humble, we've talked about. It might make you more loving of neighbors, possibly. So even suggests it could be conversional
Yeah.
It could bring about some significant changes. And at Bethel, you talked about transformative education. Right. Is that overreaching? I mean, do you see this happening? Is conversional too strong a word to use here?
I think that if you understand conversion as a process, mm-hmm. I think that works. I don't think you can understand it as it's going to be something that happens overnight. Maybe for some people it will, but I think it's it's the slow burn. Mm-hmm. It's the slow burn where, something is simmering and something is moving and it's causing you to think differently, but it's not going to happen just in a split second. It's going to happen with each successive class. It's going to happen with each successive book or article that you read, and you're going to be going, yeah, this is, I used to think this, but I'm wondering if I'm thinking something else now, and it has this impact on even how I see myself.
I think we have to approach, at least as professors, developmentally too. Yeah. I think I guess I expect to see this happening more in junior and senior level courses. It's a really difficult thing to do when you're 18 and it's your first time you're being asked to empathize deeply with people you might consider horrific in some respect. But I think empathy is really important here, because if you really take it seriously, you're leaving yourself open to connecting, entering with the mind of someone who views the world very differently from yourself. And one thing that Fia wrestles with is, can you do that if you don't leave open the possibility you will turn, you will change, you'll be converted as a result of it.
And I, as I've said to my students, even in a class last week, I said, the thing is, there is a sense sometimes of futility because, everybody's going to just stay the same. But the thing is, learning history does make you aware of, while there's a lot of resistance to change, even as Christians, you have to believe that people can change, because that's the third part of the creation fall redemption paradigm. Redemption implies that people, in fact, can change. Right. So I think, your world kind of comes crashing down on you when you are exposed to certain subjects, but then you do that with the hope of later transformation.
Yeah, I think if change over time is one of those kind of staples of historical thinking, it should suggest, not to say everything needs to change, but you should be open to it and sensitive to the ways that this has happened in the church. It's happened beyond the church. Yeah.
And, change can happen when you ask questions, when you are willing, through empathy, to stand in somebody else's shoes. And it's much easier to do that when you're actually reading the words from the people themselves, or seeing the world as they photographed it. And I think that's why history is such this beautiful tool of connection.
So we're agreed. History is awesome.
Yes,
our work here is done.
Indeed.